Welcome to the useless hour. Tonight we consider a small metal object that does not matter at all, and we are going to take our time about it. Somewhere within reach of you, quite possibly in a drawer you have not opened in some months, there is a stapler. It is grey or black, or a colour that was once described in a catalogue as putty. It weighs a little more than you expect when you pick it up, and it has never once been the most interesting thing on the desk. You have used it, at most, a few dozen times in your life, and you have never given it a single moment of deliberate thought. Tonight, we are going to give it several. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. There is nothing here that requires anything of you. The stapler was invented to solve a problem, and the problem is a good deal older than the office you are picturing. To see it properly, we have to go somewhere quieter than any modern office. We have to go to a room in the first half of the 19th century, with paper in it. Not a great deal of paper by our standards. A ledger, perhaps, some correspondence, a contract that runs to 4 sheets, and which will mean nothing whatsoever unless all 4 sheets remain together in order for as long as anyone might reasonably need to consult them. That is the whole of the difficulty. Paper is flat and light and entirely indifferent to the order you put it in. Left alone on a desk, it drifts apart. Left alone in a cupboard, it drifts apart more slowly, but it still drifts apart. The people of that period were not fools, and they had a toolkit for this. It was a small toolkit, and every item in it was a compromise. The most common answer, by a considerable margin, was the straight pin. A clerk would take an ordinary pin, of the kind otherwise used in dressmaking, gather the corners of the sheets together, and push it through. The pin held. That was its entire virtue, and it was not a small one. It held well enough that for a very long stretch of human administrative history, the pin was simply what you used, and nobody expected anything better, because nothing better had been proposed. Beyond the pin, there were other methods, each with a certain dignity of its own. You could cut small slits into the sheets and thread ribbon or cloth tape through them and tie the ends, which produced a document that was both fastened and, in a modest way, decorated. You could use sealing wax, softened and pressed, to bind or close a folded document. You could use paper wafers, those small flat seals that did much the same work with rather less ceremony. You could tie string around a bundle of documents and simply set the bundle aside. Or you could use paste, applied along a line or in a few careful dots, and press the sheets together and wait for it to dry. Every one of these worked, which is the important and slightly melancholy point. What defeated them in the end was never that they stopped functioning. It was volume. Failing at volume is a different and much more modern sort of failure, and it is the sort that eventually calls an invention into being. Consider the pin again. A pin pushed through paper leaves a hole, and that hole grows every time the sheets are turned or shuffled or pulled apart, until the corner of an important document is a small ragged crescent of damage. A pin is also, and this is the part that finished it, made of steel or of iron, and steel and iron in a room with any humidity in it will rust. Rust marks paper. Rust weakens the pin until it snaps, and a snapped pin in a stack of documents is a genuinely unpleasant thing to encounter with a fingertip. Pins rusted and tore, and could only ever be put in one at a time, by hand, by a person who had to find the pin first. The others fared no better under pressure. Ribbon threaded through slits is a lovely thing to look at, and a slow thing to do. You must cut the slits, thread the ribbon, and tie it, and none of that can be hurried. Sealing wax must be softened, applied, and allowed to set. Paste must be applied and then unavoidably waited for. Every method demanded time measured in whole minutes, and each of them asked for a small amount of skill and attention as well. For 4 sheets once a day, that is perfectly acceptable. For 400 sheets before lunch every day, it is not. And 400 sheets before lunch is more or less where the 19th century was heading. The commercial offices of that era were growing, and what they were growing was paperwork. Correspondence, invoices, receipts, bills of lading, insurance records, banking records, orders and confirmations of orders and confirmations of confirmations. Where there had been 1 clerk, there were now 6, and where there had been a ledger, there was now a room of ledgers. The volume of paper in ordinary business life rose steadily and did not stop rising. The humble question of how to keep 2 sheets together stopped being a matter of personal preference and became a gap in the market, of the kind an inventor can see from a considerable distance. Somebody was going to fill it. There was money in it. I want to reassure you at this point that none of this matters. You are not being examined on it. If you fall asleep during the middle of the 19th century and wake up somewhere near the end of it, you will have missed nothing of consequence, and I will still be here talking about the same small metal object in the same unhurried way. Now, before we meet the man who did solve this problem, we must deal with the year 1841, because 1841 is where a great many stapler histories begin, and they are not entirely right to begin there, and they are not entirely right either. In 1841, a man named Samuel Slocum of Poughkeepsie, New York, received a United States patent. The date was the 30th of September, and the patent was numbered 2275. It is a real patent. Slocum was a real man. The date is documented and the record survives, and in a field cluttered with charming stories that dissolve when you look at them directly, this one does not dissolve. The patent was for a machine for sticking pins into paper. Read that title quickly, and you will think you know what it means. You will picture a device that takes pins and drives them through a stack of documents, which is very nearly a stapler, and which would make Samuel Slocum a kind of prophet. That is not what it was. Slocum's machine was for packaging pins. The mechanism involved a sliding hopper that deposited pins into a set of grooves, where wires then pushed them into a folded sheet of paper, producing the neat rows of pins that a customer would recognize from any haberdasher's counter. The paper was the packaging, the pins were the product. The machine was a piece of manufacturing equipment for the pin trade. Its whole relationship to the fastening of documents is that it happened to involve pins and paper in the same room at the same time for entirely unrelated reasons. It fastens no documents together, and it involves no staple in the modern sense. There is no staple in it at all, only pins, and no clinching, and no stack of papers, and no clerk. And yet it is loosely and quite wrongly called the first stapler in a great many places, which is a thing that happens to any sufficiently early patent with the right words in the title. Slocum invented a way to sell pins more tidily. He deserves the credit for that, which is a perfectly respectable thing to have done, and he deserves to be released from the credit for the other thing, which he did not do. Hold on to that year, though, 1841. Remember it loosely, in the way you might remember a number from a dream, because it is about to turn up in a place it has absolutely no business being, attached to a story about a king of France, a set of gold staples, and a royal insignia, none of which happened. Before we can meet the man who invented the stapler, we must first deal with the man who did not. There is a story about the stapler that surfaces, almost without variation, in a very large number of places. It tends to be told at the very front of things, before the patents and the springs and the anvils, as a sort of overture. The story is that the first stapler in the world was made in hand for King Louis the 15th of France. It was, in the usual telling, a bespoke object, commissioned for the exclusive use of the royal court. Its staples were made of gold. Each one was engraved with the insignia of that court, so that any document fastened at the French court carried the mark of the crown in the metal itself. Some versions add jewels. Some versions add a date, and the date they add is 1841. It is a lovely little object to hold in the mind. A gilded machine on a writing desk, the small bright click of it, gold staples with a royal device stamped into each crown of wire. The story has traveled a very long way, as stories do when nobody has any particular reason to stop them. It appears on stationery company blogs, in office trivia roundups, and in a good many places that ought to know better. Several histories of the stapler open with it as a flat, undisputed fact, stated in the first sentence with the confidence of a thing everybody has always known. The first problem is a matter of simple arithmetic, and it sits in the date. Louis the 15th reigned from 1715, and he died in 1774. A stapler dated 1841, therefore, arrives 67 years after the death of the king for whom it was supposedly made. That is not a rounding error. It is longer than most people's working lives. Whoever placed that date beside that king was not making a small slip about a decade or a reign. They were describing an object commissioned by a man who had been dead for the better part of a century. The France of 1841 had by then passed through a revolution, an empire, a restoration, and the accession of an entirely different king named Louis Philippe, none of which are the sort of events one fails to notice. So the question is no longer whether the story is true. The question is where a wrong date comes from, because dates do not arrive from nowhere. They are copied, and they are copied from somewhere nearby. A reasonable account of how it happened runs as follows, and it is reasoning rather than evidence, an inference drawn from the shape of the sources rather than a thing any source states outright. There is exactly one well-documented event in the early history of paper fastening that carries the date 1841, and that is Samuel Slocum's American patent for a machine that packed pins into paper. It has nothing whatever to do with Louis the 15th, nothing to do with France, and nothing to do with gold. It is simply a genuine dated fact that sits in the same period of the story. And in the copied chronological lists that make up so much of what is written about staplers, the Slocum entry and the Louis the 15th entry sit directly beside one another, one line apart, over and over again. A date that belongs to one line appears to have slid down onto the line below it, and to have been copied onward from there by everyone who came after. In time, the date and the king were welded together, and nobody could remember them apart. The more careful sources, on the rare occasions when they repeat the claim at all, do not say 1841. They say the middle of the 18th century, which is at least a period during which Louis the 15th was alive and reigning, and in a position to commission things. That is the version that leads somewhere, so it is the one to follow. The person who followed it was the historian Mike Dash, who set out to find where the royal stapler came from, and traced the claim back through its repetitions to see what it rested on. The trail does not lead to Versailles, or to a French archive, or a workshop, or a goldsmith. It leads to New York, and to a man named Jack Linsky, the founder of the American Stapler Company that the world would come to know as Swingline. Linsky is not a suspicious figure in this story, and he deserves some fairness because he has been badly served by everyone who came afterwards. He and his wife Belle were serious collectors of decorative arts of the Louis the 15th era. This was no whim and no piece of corporate decoration. The collection was real, assembled with real knowledge over many years, and substantial enough that it eventually went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So we have a man who manufactured staplers for a living, and who separately, in another part of his life entirely, knew a great deal about 18th century French objects. Those two facts sitting in the same person is the whole engine of what followed. In a magazine article published in 1962, Jack Linsky mentioned that he owned a stapler said to be from the Louis the 15th era. That single remark, made in passing by a collector about a curio in his own possession, lightly sourced, unaccompanied by any documentation, is the seed of everything you have ever read about the golden stapler of the French court. The finding that matters most concerns what the 1962 source does not contain, and it is the thing that turns a vague claim into a manufactured one. The gold is not in the 1962 source. The jewels are not in it. The engraved insignia of the royal court is not in it. None of the details that make the story worth telling were present when the story was first told. They appear to have been added later by other writers around the year 2000, roughly 4 decades after Linsky's original and much vaguer remark. The stapler was not gilded in the 18th century. It was gilded at the turn of the 21st by people writing copy. If any of this is beginning to feel like a great deal to keep hold of, please let it go. There will be no examination. Nothing in this account will ever be asked of you, and you are under no obligation whatsoever to remember which century the gold was added in. The institutions that might be expected to endorse the story do not endorse it. The German Patent and Trademark Office, which maintains its own history of the stapler and has no particular stake in disappointing anybody, addresses the royal stapler directly and declines to accept it. Its verdict is not scornful. It is simply that the claim is not sufficiently proven, which is the politest possible way of noting that in more than 60 years nobody has produced anything to prove it with. And nothing ever has surfaced. There is no signed document, no court inventory lists such an object among the royal effects, and the French court inventoried a remarkable quantity of things. No museum accession record for it exists anywhere. There is no 18th century French reference of any kind in any archive to Louis the 15th owning a paper fastening device, gold or otherwise. Every historian who has gone looking has come back with the same thing, which is nothing at all. The object at the center of the story has never been photographed, catalogued, exhibited, or seen. What remains when the gold has been taken off is a considerably better story than the one it replaced. A 20th century American businessman mentioned once in a magazine that he had a stapler he had been told was French and rather old. Nobody checked. The remark was copied, and in the copying it acquired gold, and then jewels, and then an engraved royal crest, and somewhere along the way it was handed a date that belonged to a completely unrelated patent for a pin packing machine, which happened to be sitting next to it on a list. 4 decades of patient and unmalicious repetition turned a collector's offhand aside into a fact about a king. That is not an unusual thing to have happened. It is very close to being the ordinary way that a great deal of what everybody knows comes to be known. Somewhere at the bottom of a very great many confidently stated facts, there is a man in 1962 saying something mild about an object on his shelf, and no one in all the years since thinking to go and look. The man who actually solved it was called George W. McGill, and he solved it slowly. On the 24th of July, 1866, McGill was granted a United States patent, numbered 56,587, for a small bendable paper fastener made of brass. It was not a machine, and it was not a stapler in any sense that would be recognized on a modern desk. It was a little two-pronged object, closer in spirit to a brad than to anything else, and its entire purpose was to pass through a slit cut in a stack of paper and then be folded over on the far side so that it could not come back out. That was the invention, a shaped piece of soft metal sold by the box, designed to be bent. Picture for a moment what using one of these was actually like, because the experience of it is the reason everything else in this story happened. You began with a stack of paper you wished to keep together. You made a slit through it. You then took one brass fastener between your fingers, aligned its two prongs with the slit, and pushed it through, which required a certain amount of care, because the prongs were soft and the paper was not always willing. Then you turned the whole stack over, found the two prongs now protruding from the back, and pressed them outwards and downwards until they lay flat against the page. Then you turned the stack the right way up again, and you had fastened one thing. If you had 40 things to fasten, you did that 40 times. This was, by the standards of pins and wax and ribbon, an enormous improvement. It was also, by the standards of a working office, still quite slow. The first interesting thing about George McGill is that he appears to have understood that immediately. He did not stop. Just over a year later, on the 13th of August, 1867, he was granted a second patent, numbered 67,665, for a press. The press did the fiddly part. It cut the slit and it inserted the fastener in one operation, using a mechanism rather than fingertips. The fastener itself was still bent flat by hand afterwards, but the delicate and easily botched business of getting the metal through the paper in the first place had been handed over to a machine. The two inventions together made a system, and the system reached the market by 1869, a box of small brass fasteners and a press to put them in. For an office in the late 1860s, this was a real answer to a real nuisance, and it is the point at which McGill stops being a man with an idea and becomes a man with a product. That might have been the natural resting place of the whole endeavor. McGill did not treat it as one. In 1874, he received a further patent for what was called a fastener punch, another refinement of the same narrow problem, approached from a slightly different angle by the same person some 8 years after he first started thinking about it. And then, on the 18th of February, 1879, 13 years after the brass fastener, George McGill was granted United States Patent number 212,316 for a device for inserting metallic staples in paper. This was the McGill single-stroke staple press number 1, and it is the moment the modern stapler exists. Others had driven wire through paper before him. The difference was that this machine drove the staple and clinched it, folded the two legs flat against the underside of the stack in a single downward stroke with no second operation, no turning the papers over, no bending anything by hand. You pressed once, the machine did both halves of the job. That is the gesture that everyone who has ever used a stapler has made, and 1879 is when it starts. The object itself deserves an unromantic description because it was not elegant. The McGill single-stroke staple press No. 1 weighed a little over a kilogram. That is more than 2 pounds of iron and steel sitting on a desk to perform a task that today is performed by something you can knock off the edge of a table with your elbow. It was not portable in any meaningful sense. It was a piece of equipment of the kind you placed somewhere and then walked to. And it held exactly one staple. One. The machine that finally combined driving and clinching into a single graceful motion had to be reloaded by hand after every single fastening. You loaded a staple, you pressed. You had fastened one stack of paper. Then you loaded another staple. The great leap forward of 1879 was therefore a leap forward in the quality of the stroke, and not at all in the number of strokes available. A clerk with a large pile of documents would have spent a considerable portion of the afternoon simply putting small pieces of wire into a heavy metal box, one at a time, for hours. None of this needs to be remembered. It is simply how it was. The German Patent and Trademark Office, in its own account of the history of the stapler, treats this 1879 patent rather than the earlier ones as the true birth of the modern stapler mechanism. That is a considered institutional judgment about which of one man's patents counts as the beginning of a thing, and it lands on the third of them, not the first. The machine had a long commercial life. The single-stroke staple press was advertised from 1880 all the way through to 1913, a run of 33 years, and it was manufactured by Holmes, Booth and Hayden's of New York. 33 years is a long time for any object to remain on sale in more or less its original form, and that span contains a great deal. A press first advertised in 1880 was still being offered for sale to offices on the eve of the First World War. It outlasted the entire working lifetime of most of the clerks who first bought one. Somewhere in the middle of that run, the machine stopped being a novelty and became simply a thing that was on the desk, unremarkable, unremarked upon, doing the job it had been built to do. A little earlier, in 1876, McGill reportedly showed his paper fasteners at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, the great national exhibition of American industry and ingenuity, full of engines and telegraphy and enormous machinery, and on some table somewhere within it, a small assortment of bent brass objects for holding two sheets of paper together. Across his working life, George W. McGill held more than 50 patents relating to paper fasteners. 50. Not 50 patents across a varied career of invention spread over transport and agriculture and lighting in the manner of the restless 19th century tinkerer. 50 patents on the question of how to attach one piece of paper to another piece of paper. He did not dabble. He appears to have looked at a small and thoroughly unglamorous problem in the middle of the 1860s and then given several decades of his life to it, returning to it again and again, refining the shape of a prong, the action of a press, the geometry of a clinch, long after any reasonable person would have concluded that the matter was settled. The popular record needs a correction here. The story is very often flattened into a single sentence. George McGill invented the stapler in 1866. That sentence is not quite a lie, but it is a considerable simplification, and it does McGill a disservice by compressing him. What he unambiguously pioneered in 1866 was the bendable metal paper fastener itself, the consumable, and not the machine. In 1867, he added a mechanized means of inserting that fastener. The single-stroke clinching machine that everybody actually pictures when they hear the word stapler did not arrive until 1879, 13 years later, from the very same man, arrived at by increments. The increments are the interesting part, rather than the flat headline. A one-sentence origin story gives you a flash of genius in 1866 and nothing else. The real shape of it is a person circling the same small question for over a decade. Fastener, then press, then punch, then at last a machine that could do the whole thing in one motion. Each step obviously sensible only once the previous step had been taken. That is what invention mostly looks like when you slow it down enough to watch. A great deal of patience applied to something very minor. You do not need to hold on to any of the dates. They will still be true in the morning. What you have to understand about the second half of the 19th century is that George McGill was not alone in that room. He was not even close to alone. If you go looking through the patent records of the 1860s and 1870s for people trying to hold two pieces of paper together by mechanical means, you do not find a lone genius with a good idea. You find a crowd. Dozens of men in different cities and on different continents working in complete ignorance of one another, filing near-identical drawings of near-identical little machines within weeks and sometimes within days of each other. It is one of the stranger patterns in the history of invention, and it recurs constantly. A problem sits untouched for 4,000 years, and then, quite suddenly, everybody solves it at once. You can watch it happening in close range in a single American summer. McGill's first paper fastener patent was issued in the July of 1866. 14 days later, on the 7th of August 1866, the Novelty Manufacturing Company of Philadelphia registered a design for a paper stapler. 14 days. Two entirely separate parties in two separate cities arriving at the same small answer to the same small question inside a single fortnight, neither of them aware of the other, and both of them convinced they had thought of something. There is no drama in the record about this. Nobody wrote a letter of outrage that survives. The two things simply happened, side by side, and the archive holds them both without comment. 2 years afterwards, there is a man in St. Louis called Albert J. Kletzker. What he held was United States Patent number 83,640, granted on the 3rd of November 1868, and given the title of An Improvement in Paper Fasteners. That word improvement is worth sitting with for a moment, because it appears again and again across this period, and it tells you exactly what kind of field this was. Nobody in 1868 believed they were inventing the paper fastener. They believed they were improving it. Each of them had seen the thing that existed, judged it insufficient, and produced a slightly better version, and each of them filed that slightly better version at almost precisely the moment that 4 other men were doing the same. Of all of them, the one who came genuinely close was Henry Reno Hale, and he came close in 1877. His patent, number 195,603, described a machine that brought the two halves of the task together into something considerably more unified than anything before it, pushing the staple through the paper and then folding its legs down flat on the other side. That is the whole problem in miniature, and everything else in this story is bookkeeping. Hale solved a large part of it, and solved it neatly, and some historians who have spent time with these documents argue that he has a claim to have invented the modern stapler, which is every bit as strong as the claim usually given to McGill. He is not, on the whole, the name that gets handed to school children. There is no particular injustice being alleged here. It is simply that history has room for one name per object, and Hale was not the one it kept. And then 1879, which is the year the field became genuinely absurd. On the 5th of August, 1879, William J. Brown, Jr. took out United States Patent number 218,227 for a device for inserting and clinching metallic staples. Inserting and clinching. That is, word for word, the thing the modern stapler does, described in the language of the period. And it arrived in the same calendar year as McGill's own definitive patent for very much the same idea. Two men in one country arriving independently at one machine inside 12 months. The following year, in 1880, a stapling machine that fed its wire from a spool was patented as well, and the name attached to it has not traveled down to us with any confidence at all. It sits in the record as the thing that was done by somebody once. Across the Atlantic, meanwhile, an entirely separate line of the same idea was running in parallel, and it needs to be kept separate because it is very frequently and very wrongly folded into the American story. In Birmingham, England, a man named Charles Henry Gould held a British patent dated the 5th of March, 1868, for a wire stitcher intended for the binding of pamphlets and magazines. The machine did something rather elegant with wire that had not yet been cut into anything. Plain, continuous, uncut wire fed in from a length of it. It cut that wire to the correct size itself, sharpened the business ends, forced those pointed ends down through the paper, and then folded them on the far side. It made the staple and used the staple in the same motion, from raw material at the moment of need. Now, Gould's name has a habit of attaching itself in various retellings to the Hotchkiss company and to the American machines that carry that name, and it should not. There is no connection. Gould's patent is British. It is dated 1868, and it belongs to him. The Hotchkiss line is American. It comes almost 3 decades later, and it belongs to other people entirely, whom we will meet in due course. The two stories are frequently run together into one, and when you see them run together, you are looking at an error repeated confidently for a very long time. Gould stands on his own. He deserves to. And none of which is anything you need to retain. The dates will not be asked of you. If Charles Henry Gould of Birmingham slips away from you entirely in the next few minutes, he will not mind, and neither will I. A great many people solving the same problem at the same time has one inevitable consequence, and the consequence is lawyers. The pioneers of this field were, reportedly, notoriously litigious. McGill himself, a man named Albertus Weeks, and the Philadelphia Novelty Manufacturing Company are named in the accounts as repeat opponents, suing one another and being sued in return over claims that overlapped because there was almost no possible way for them not to overlap. Which meant, in practical terms, that grown men in good coats engaged professional lawyers and paid them by the hour, and traveled to courtrooms and stood before judges of the United States and argued at length and at expense about which of them possessed the exclusive right to hold two pieces of paper together. The court heard the arguments and considered them, and this went on for years. Somewhere behind the lawsuits, though, sits the best material in this whole crowded graveyard, which is the branch that lost. Among the many competing answers to the paper problem, there was one whole family of machines that dispensed with the staple altogether. Devices such as the clipless stand machine, and one sold under the name Bump's New Model Paper Fastener, are described as working on a principle that is, when you first hear it, genuinely delightful. They did not drive metal through the paper. They cut a small tongue out of the stack of paper itself, and then folded that tongue back through the sheets, and the paper held itself together. No staple, no wire, no consumable of any kind, and nothing entering the document that was not already part of the document. They were, the accounts suggest, sold into the 1920s. That is a real commercial life, decades of it, in offices, on desks, purchased by people who compared the options available and chose this one. And they lost completely. And they lost to a machine that requires you to buy small pieces of metal forever, and to remember to buy them, and to notice when you have run out. On any reasonable accounting, the stapleless machine was the more elegant idea. It needed nothing, and it could not run empty. Elegance, it turns out, was not the thing that won. What won was this, and I offer it as reasoning rather than as anything anybody wrote down at the time. The machine that was going to take the office had to solve 3 problems at once. It had to clinch reliably, folding the legs flat without a person having to bend them afterwards by hand. It needed to hold staples that arrived already joined together, so that nobody was loading them one at a time like a musket. And the whole thing had to be simple enough and cheap enough that an ordinary business could buy them by the dozen without a conversation about it. Almost every entrant in the 19th century solved one of those 3. Some solved 2. 1 was never enough, and 2 was not enough either. And the graveyard is full of machines that were right about exactly the part of the problem that did not decide it. The company at the center of what follows begins in Norwalk, Connecticut in 1895, when a modest concern was incorporated there under the entirely unremarkable name of the Jones Manufacturing Company. Nothing about that name suggests anything at all. It could have made anything or nothing, and passed out of the record without troubling a single historian. Among the organizing principals, however, were 2 men named Hotchkiss, George Hotchkiss and his son Eli Hubble Hotchkiss. They were, at that moment, simply 2 of the names on the incorporation papers. The firm was a small American manufacturer of small metal implements in a small Connecticut city, in a decade thick with small American manufacturers of small metal implements. There was no reason for anyone to write down what they looked like or what they said to one another, and so nobody did. In 1897, 2 years after the incorporation, Eli acquired majority control of the firm, and with control came, as it usually does, a change of name. The Jones Manufacturing Company became the E.H. Hotchkiss Company, and the surname of a Connecticut businessman was quietly printed onto the letterhead, onto the catalogues, and in due course onto the machines themselves. That stamping of a name onto a piece of metal is the entire mechanism of everything that comes afterwards, which is worth pausing on for a moment. There was no invention involved in it, and no breakthrough. Simply a man buying a controlling interest in a company and putting his own name on the products, the way thousands of men did in that decade, almost all of them to no lasting linguistic effect whatsoever. The patent lineage of the machine itself needs to be handled with some care, because collective folklore has muddled it thoroughly over the past century, and the muddle is repeated confidently in a great many places. The device that the company would sell was covered by patents granted on the 1st of December, 1896. On that day, a stapling machine was patented by James A. Keyes and assigned to the Greenfield Automatic Fastener Company. The patent bears the number 572,346. It has nothing to do with the Birmingham wire stitcher we met earlier, which belongs to a different country, a different decade and a different story entirely, and which has been welded on to the Hotchkiss account by careless repetition more times than can now be undone. On that very same 1st of December, 1896, a second patent was granted, this one to Edwin T. Greenfield, covering the feature that gives those early machines their genuinely strange appearance, this spiral coil feed magazine. If you have seen a photograph of an early Hotchkiss stapler and found it faintly unsettling without being able to say why, this is the reason. The staples were not held in a straight flat channel, as they are in the machine sitting in your desk drawer. They were held in a coil, wound round on itself, which projected from the back of the device in a curling metal tail. The machine looks, in consequence, less like a stapler and more like a small mechanical animal that has been asked to sit still. The device was first sold by the Jones Manufacturing Company under the name the Star Paper Fastener, which is a perfectly decent name that has left absolutely no trace on any language on Earth. Once Hotchkiss took control, it was rebranded, and it became the Hotchkiss No. 1, first sold in 1895. What it did well. It fed a connected strip of staples from that coiled magazine, one after another, which meant that the person using it did not have to load each individual staple by hand before each individual use. Set against the machines that came before it, this was a genuine and substantial leap, and the officers of the period bought it accordingly. The Hotchkiss No. 1 was still being marketed as late as 1950, which is to say that a design from the closing years of the 19th century was still being sold to offices in the era of the jet engine. And then a Hotchkiss machine was put on a ship. The first stapler ever sold in Japan in 1903 was an imported Hotchkiss machine, not a Japanese design and not a licensed copy, but an American import, arriving in a country where no comparable implement had previously existed. There was no established Japanese word waiting for it, because there had been nothing for such a word to describe. It was simply an object, newly arrived, doing something new, and stamped along its body with the name of the Connecticut company that had made it. People needed to call it something. They called it what it said on the side. That is the ordinary way a name attaches to a thing, and it usually goes no further than a shop or a season. A product arrives, the label on it is the only word available, and the label does the work of a noun until a proper noun turns up to replace it. Almost always a proper one does. The imported brand gets translated or displaced, or quietly forgotten when a domestic manufacturer arrives with a name of its own. The unusual part here is not that it happened at all, but that nothing ever came along to undo it. To this day, the standard, ordinary, entirely unremarkable Japanese word for a stapler is hochikisu. It is not a technical term, or a brand preference, or something a specialist would use and a shopkeeper would not. It is the plain, everyday noun, used by school children and civil servants and stationery shops in a country of well over 100 million people, for a small metal object that sits on almost every desk. The surname of a 19th century Norwalk businessman, printed on a shipment of office equipment, became the common word for a thing on the other side of the world, and has stayed there for more than 120 years. There is an English parallel, though a weaker one, in the way Xerox became a verb, so that people spoke of Xeroxing a document, regardless of who had made the machine. But the Hotchkiss case is more complete and quieter, and, in its way, more permanent. Xerox remains a company that people can name, The E.H. Hotchkiss Company long ago stopped being a household name in the country that produced it. Almost nobody in America would now recognize the word as a brand at all. And yet the name survives in daily use thousands of miles from Connecticut, in the mouths of people who have no reason ever to have heard of Norwalk and no reason to care. You do not need to remember any of this. It will make no difference to your day tomorrow. It is simply true, and it has been true without interruption since 1903. Now, honesty requires a complication, and this is where a great deal of confusion has settled over the years. There was another Hotchkiss. Benjamin Berkeley Hotchkiss, who lived from 1826 to 1885, was a real and entirely separate American ordnance engineer. He moved to France in 1867 and there developed the Hotchkiss revolving barrel machine gun, a weapon that carried his name across the armies of Europe. He is not a myth, and he is not a confusion in himself. He was a different man, running a different enterprise on another continent, with no business connection whatsoever to the small stationery firm in Norwalk. Whether the two men were related by blood is a question that remains genuinely unresolved, and it is unresolved even among their own descendants, which is where such questions usually go to be settled. One family researcher states flatly that Benjamin and Eli belonged to two entirely different families, with no relation between them at all. Another descendant holds that they were distant cousins, while adding that the relationship was not a close one. Those two positions have not been reconciled. It would be tidier to pick one, and tidiness is not available here. So the matter must be left standing open, exactly as the record leaves it. The point that matters, though, is a clean one and worth being precise about. There is a persistent urban legend, circulating mostly in Japanese, which holds that the word Hotchkiss comes from the machine gun inventor rather than from the stationery company. It is an appealing story, and researchers reject it. The etymology runs through the company in Norwalk, through the letterhead, through the stamped name on an imported desk implement in 1903. Even if Benjamin and Eli should one day turn out to share some remote and distant ancestor, it would change nothing about the word. The word did not come from the gun. It came from a label on a box of office equipment. Underneath all of the patents and the lawsuits and competing brass contraptions, there was only one question that really mattered, and for decades nobody could answer it properly. The question was not how to push a piece of wire through a stack of paper. That part was never hard. A sharpened wire will go through 20 sheets of foolscap the way a needle goes through cloth, and any decent spring and lever will do the pushing for you. The difficulty was what happened on the other side. Once the two legs of the staple have come through and are standing up on the underside of the paper, sharp and open and pointing at nothing, something has to catch each leg and turn it inward and press it flat, so that the staple becomes a closed loop rather than two spikes waiting for a thumb. That folding is called the clinch, and it is where the difficulty always sat. For a long while, the clinch was simply the user's problem. You drove the fastener through, and then you turned the papers over, and then you bent the legs down by hand, one at a time, using your thumbnail or the flat of a knife or whatever was on the desk. This worked in the narrow sense that the papers ended up joined together, and it did not work in any wider sense than that. It was slow, it was uneven, the legs went flat at different angles or refused to go flat at all, and the operator's thumb took a small amount of damage every few dozen documents. An office handling 400 documents in a morning cannot be turning every one of them. The device that solves this is the Anvil. It is a small and unpromising-looking thing, the sort of engineering that seems like nothing until you have looked at it for a while, and then seems like the only sensible way it could have been done. The anvil is the small metal plate that sits underneath the paper, in the base of the stapler, directly below where the staple comes down. It is a flat rectangle of shaped steel, usually able to swivel, and cut into its upper face are two shallow grooves, curved, each one a smooth crescent scooped out of the metal. The grooves are where the folding happens. When the staple is driven downwards, its two legs pass through the paper and strike the floor of the grooves. They cannot continue downward because the steel will not let them. They cannot go straight back up because the driver is still coming down behind them with the full force of your hand on it. So each leg does the only thing left to it and follows the curve. The groove turns the leg through a quarter circle, guiding it sideways and then inwards and then upwards again, until the point of the wire is traveling back towards the paper it just came out of, and the last part of the stroke presses it down flat. Both legs do this at once, in mirror image, in the time it takes you to lower your hand. The staple that went in as an open square comes out the other side as a closed rectangle, with two flat tails folded neatly towards each other, and the operator never saw any of it happen, and never had to turn the paper over. It works rather like a lock. The force you supply for one purpose is turned to a second purpose you were not thinking about by a shaped piece of metal that never moves. The first machine to do all of it in a single downward stroke, driving and clinching together with no second manual step, was George McGill's device of 1879. Everything that came afterwards, every stapler in every drawer in every office you have ever sat in, is a refinement of that arrangement rather than a replacement for it. The grooves got shallower over the years, and the steel got better, and the idea itself did not change. The second question was supply. A machine that clinches beautifully is of limited use if you have to load it by hand with one staple at a time, which is exactly what the early single-stroke presses required. So the staples themselves had to be reorganized, and here too quite separate lineages developed, running alongside one another for a long while without much reference to each other. The first lineage arrives in 1895 with the strip-cut machines. These fed a connected strip of staples joined together in a continuous run from a coiled magazine, a spiral of wound staple strip curled up in a housing at the back of the machine like a clock spring or a roll of film. The magazine unspooled and fed forward, and the machine cut and shaped and drove each staple as it came. It also gave those early machines a distinctive silhouette, with a long curled tail behind the working head, which is why 19th century staplers so often look, to a modern eye, slightly like small artillery. The second arrives in 1927, and it is the one that ended up in your desk drawer. These were cohered staple strips, sometimes called frozen wire, and the innovation was in the manufacturing rather than the machine. Instead of coiling a continuous run of wire, the maker produced the staples already formed, already bent into their shape, and already joined edge to edge in a straight, flat row, so that the strip arrived as a rigid little bar of staples standing shoulder to shoulder. That flat row is the direct ancestor of the strip you drop into a stapler today, and the small sound it makes when it seats itself is the sound of a decision taken in 1927 that nobody has since found a reason to revisit. There is also a third thread from a different part of the trade altogether. The Boston wire stitcher line is separately credited with a cemented strip staple, staples glued together into a strip rather than joined by the metal itself, and the date on that one is not firmly settled, so hold it loosely. It came out of the industrial bookbinding side of the business, from machines that bound magazines and pamphlets in quantity, rather than from anybody thinking about a person at a desk. Boston Wire Stitcher itself was founded in 1996 in Arlington, Massachusetts by Thomas Briggs, and it did not begin with offices at all. It began with treadle-operated machines, worked by foot, for wire stitching books and calendars and hat boxes. That was the company at the start, a workshop, a foot pedal, and no offices anywhere in it. The first foot-operated machine proper came in 1903. Shortly after that came the Model A staple binder, which was the first to use pre-formed staples mounted on metal cores, and then in 1914 the Model AO, the company's first genuinely portable stapling machine, small enough to be picked up and carried and set down somewhere else. That machine is a direct ancestor of most of the small portable staplers that came after it. The company, over the following decades, contracted its own name down to something shorter and more sayable, and became Bostitch. The third problem was not a mechanical one, it was ergonomic. Even once you could clinch reliably and feed from a strip, reloading a stapler remained a small ordeal. The older machines loaded from the bottom or from the side, and getting a fresh strip into one could involve a screwdriver or partial disassembly, or a period of fishing about inside a metal housing with 2 fingers and a growing sense of grievance. The man who removed all of that was Jack Linsky, who founded his company in New York City in 1925 under the name the Parrott Speed Fastener Company. Linsky had traveled in Europe in the 1920s and came back from that trip with the design that settled the matter, the open-channel top-loading mechanism. The upper channel of the stapler is hinged. You take hold of it, you swing it open, and the whole staple track is lying there in front of you, uncovered, facing upwards. A full strip drops straight in from above under its own weight. You close the channel. That is the entire operation. It takes about 2 seconds, and it asks for no tools and no particular patience. Set against a screwdriver and a partial disassembly, that is a large and quiet saving, and nearly every stapler manufactured since has been built around the same hinge. Manufacturing moved to Long Island City in 1931. The company renamed itself Speed Products in 1939 and only became Swingline in 1956, which means that the best-known name in the history of staplers is, in company terms, a late arrival, turning up more than 30 years for the firm that carried it. The name is generally said to come from the swinging top-loading channel itself, the product feature naming the brand rather than the other way round. A design patent in 1951 and a utility patent in 1955 are associated with the company's mechanisms, though those two are worth holding a little more loosely than the rest. The clinch, the strip, and the hinge were arrived at across roughly 80 years by people who were, for the most part, trying to make an object a little less annoying to use, and who were not attempting anything grander than that. It will all still be true in the morning, whether or not you are awake for it. There is one more episode in this history, and it runs backwards. In 1999, a small American film called Office Space was made about the quiet indignities of working in an open-plan office, and among its characters was a mumbling, much-ignored man named Milton Wadhams, whose entire remaining attachment to his employer was expressed through his red stapler. That stapler is now one of the most recognizable objects in modern comedy. And at the moment the film was made, it did not exist. Swingline did not manufacture a red stapler. It had never offered one, and no member of the public could have bought one at any price. The company's commercial colors were black and a soft gray putty, and that was the whole of the range. What happened instead was a matter of ordinary set dressing. The film's prop master, a man named Stan Gilbert, went out and sourced what any prop master would have sourced, a standard swing-line desk stapler, the Model 747, the plain black machine that sat on several million American desks without ever once being noticed. Director Mike Judge looked at it and wanted something else. He wanted the object to be more visually distinct and more bulbous so that it would read clearly on screen as the one possession this particular man cared about. And so the prop department did the thing that prop departments have always done, which is to solve the problem in the cheapest available way. They took a standard black stapler and they sprayed it with red automotive paint. That is the whole of it. There was no design process behind it and no manufacturing decision, only a can of car paint and an afternoon in which to use it. The object that ended up in front of the camera was a one-off, hand-painted piece of studio property, and it corresponded to nothing at all in the catalogue of the company whose name was stamped on it. In the ordinary run of things, this is where the story would stop, and the red stapler would have joined the vast, unremarked population of props that exist only for the length of a shot. Instead, the film became a cult object. It did modestly in cinemas, and then it kept going, quietly, year after year, in the way that certain films do, until a great many people who had spent time in offices had seen it and recognized themselves in it. And a number of those people, reasonably enough, wanted the stapler. They went looking for it. They went into stationery shops and asked for the red swing line, and were told, politely and correctly, that there was no such thing. Some of them wrote to the company to ask where it could be found. What all of them were doing, in the plainest sense, was attempting to purchase an object that had never been manufactured. And then, in 2002, 3 years after the film's release, Swingline manufactured it. The company produced a red 747 in a color it named Rio Red and put it on sale. It went on to become the second best-selling stapler in the company's range, after the plain black original from which the film's prop had been made. It is worth taking the sequence slowly. A black stapler was painted red to serve a fictional character, and the fiction was seen, and the audience wanted the object, and the object was then made, in the real world, by the real company, in the color it had been given by a fiction that had borrowed it in the first place. It is a rare and unusually clean case of an imaginary thing reaching backwards into the world and arranging for itself to be manufactured, and one of the few that is documented plainly enough to be stated without qualification. From here, the history thins out into small things, and we can take them slowly, one at a time, because there is no hurry left in this at all. The staple you are most likely to have used today has a designation, and the designation is the 26-6. It is not a model name, and it is not a brand. The 26 is the gauge of the wire, the measure of its thickness, and the 6 is the length of the leg in millimeters, which is the part that goes through the paper. 2 numbers, one for how thick and one for how long, and between them they describe the standard fastening of the modern office. Nobody chose it as a matter of ceremony. It simply settled, the way these things settle, and then stopped moving. They arrive in strips, and the strips are also standardized. A full strip holds 200 staples. A half strip holds 100. There is nothing more to it than that, and it is offered here for no reason beyond its own tidiness. 200 and 100. Then there is the matter of undoing the work. The device that pulls a staple back out of paper, the small hinged jaw with 4 teeth that sits in the second drawer of every desk, was the invention of a man named William G. Pankonin of Chicago. He filed his application on the 12th of December, 1932, and the patent was granted to him on the 3rd of March, 1936, numbered 2,033,050. Roughly 65 or 70 years separate the first practical desktop staplers from the moment anybody thought to patent a dedicated tool for reversing them. For nearly 7 decades, people fastened paper together, and then, when they needed it apart again, worked it loose with whatever was to hand. The fastening had to become common enough and permanent enough to turn into a problem of its own before anybody thought the antidote worth inventing. There are institutions in this too, which is not a thing one expects. There is an actual museum of early office equipment, the Early Office Museum, which maintains a patent-by-patent archive of staplers and paper fasteners, catalogued and cross-referenced alongside a gallery of antique strip staple machines. Somebody assembled that, and somebody keeps it up. And the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History holds a Hotchkiss No. 1 in its permanent collection, a stapler, accessioned into a national museum, preserved and recorded and held in trust in the same building and under the same care as the objects one expects to find in such places. There are older echoes, though they are echoes only. Iron dovetail clamps were used in the ancient world to hold blocks of masonry together, sunk into the stone so that 2 pieces would behave as one. And medieval armorers used small fasteners called vervels to attach a curtain of mail to a helmet. Both are sometimes mentioned in the same breath as the stapler, and both are said to be similar ideas rather than related ones. There is no lineage here. No one carried the thought forward. It is simply that a problem of the same shape can be solved in the same shape twice, 2,000 years apart, by people who would never have understood a word the other said. So that is the account, more or less complete. Decades of sustained effort by people who took the whole business perfectly seriously. More than 50 patents from one man alone, spent entirely inside this single narrow question. Lawsuits and rival claims, and designs that solved 1/3 of the problem and were quietly discontinued. A story about a French king that turns out to be a collector's remark, gilded by repetition until it acquired jewels it never had. A brand name that fell out of an American company and landed in the Japanese language, where it stayed, and where it remains long after most people using it had any idea it was ever anybody's surname. And a color that did not exist until a film invented it and the world went looking for it. All of that went into the business of holding 2 pieces of paper together, which was the only thing any of it was ever for. There is nothing here you need to remember. Not the numbers, not the dates, not the names. You will not be asked about the 26-6. No one will test you on Pankonin or on the year of the Rio Red. And nothing in your life will go better or worse for having retained them. They have been set down carefully because they are true, and because true things deserve to be set down carefully, and for no other reason. You are permitted to let every one of them go. That is rather the point of them. An hour spent on something that does not matter is an hour that cannot be taken from you by anything that does, and if these facts slip away as you drift, they were never anywhere else but here. Sleep well, and when you next find yourself wanting to forget, just for an hour, everything that actually matters, the useless hour will be waiting. Good night.